in this segment, now that we've seen some of the things that these transformer language models can do, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the news that these have made recently, because they've really kind of exploded and taken off in terms of what big companies are doing with them. So one of the biggest and most prominent of these models is one called BERT. And this was released from Google a couple of years ago. And this has had a huge impact on the field of natural language processing. BERT is very similar. It's a transformer-based model. It's very similar to what we've seen so far. There are a few differences, but basically it's the same thing as on that site, right, with transformer. And this model now underlies a lot of Google's technology, and in particular, it is reported to impact 1 in 10 of all search queries. So this is a big change to Google search, and it represents a big advance in our ability to use smart machine learning techniques to do better stuff with what you're searching for. So for example, we can come back to this Rocky Mountain National Park Visitor Center thing that we talked about at the very beginning. And the way that Google answers this is that it uses a language model. It treats this question that you typed in as a context, and it treats the possible answers, things on different web pages, as contexts as well. And it uses this neural network to basically cook these things down into numbers that it can then compare. So it's not using the language model necessarily to predict the next word. Instead, it's using sort of products of the computation inside the neural network. And what those products of the computation allow it to do is it allows it to do a kind of text similarity. It lets it say, okay, this thing about visitor centers, Rocky Mountain National Park, well, I can see that that's very similar to the text on this website. And so I'm going to do a kind of soft matching between these. And then once we've softly matched these, we can figure out that, okay, this website actually answers the question that you typed in, and then it uses a kind of separate model to actually figure out how to get the answer out. So literally, it's true that when you type in this kind of a question, you're using one of these models when it produces the answer. And so I think this is one of the more exciting things that's happened with Google search recently. If you did this 5 years ago, it wouldn't have been able to answer this question, and that's in large part due to the development of these types of transformer models. So another one that has come out is a model called GPT-3. There was an earlier GPT-1 and GPT-2, and these have been developed by a company called OpenAI, and the technology has been licensed to Microsoft and others. So the model here is essentially the same thing as on Write with Transformer. You might have even seen in that slider you were picking a GPT-2 model. GPT-3 is just a bigger version of that. And what people have wanted to do with this is use this huge model to do things like medical diagnosis. Like, I have a cough and a runny nose and a sore throat. The disease I have is tab complete. All right, this is probably not a good idea. The model will produce something, but if you remember some of those examples we saw before, it doesn't always do reasonable stuff. And so I'm not going to trust this model to be my doctor anytime soon. But it's still the case that the models can do some cool stuff here, and there's a lot of people trying to figure out in the past year or two how they can use this to build cool applications. But there are also some concerns about these aspects. For example, this sort of medical setting, right? I mean, how do we make sure that people aren't being misled by these models, which really don't know anything about medicine? They're just taking information that they've seen before and kind of memorizing it. So there have been some recent critiques of these papers, and one of the most notable ones is a paper led by Emily Bender and Timnit Gebru called On the Dangers of Stochastic Parrots: Can Language Models Be Too Big? So they talk about several issues with these models. The first is a possible negative environmental impact, where if these models become very widespread, they're very large and actually require a lot of computation. And after a while, it starts to have a very large carbon footprint because we need to use a lot of electricity to power the graphics cards, essentially, that are running these models. Another issue is that these models can encode bias. They're trained over a ton of text from the web, and the problem is that the internet is sort of this wild place that has a lot of bad stuff. And so if you want, you can go back to that site and try to type out some context about white people versus black people versus Muslims and see how the model's completions differ. And some of the things are, encode some kind of bias and racism in them. Finally, their critique is that these models are just parrots. They're memorizing things, but not truly understanding language. And so it's easy to look at these things like, oh, it knows that Steph Curry is very good at shooting, shooting three-pointers. But in fact, the model's just memorized that. It's not like it watched a broadcast or understands what shooting a three-pointer is. So there's a lot of interesting stuff in this critique. And one of the biggest things that we've seen come out of this is that actually, after this paper was submitted for publication, Timnit Gebru was fired from Google. And she was a very prominent manager there of a big team working on ethical AI. Now, a part of why she was fired is very likely due to her advocacy for black people within Google. But it's also possibly the case that Google doesn't want to hear critiques of these big language models that it's built a lot of its business around. So it's a very complicated situation, but these large language models, like we've been seeing, they're not just a kind of exercise in the computer science class, but in fact, a thing that's making headlines in the Washington Post and the New York Times and other big news sources. So we're seeing these models get used in a lot of big companies and having big impacts on society. And so there's a huge conversation going on around them right now. So this is part of the reason why in this module, we wanted to focus on language models just to see what they can do and what kind of impact they can have. And so over the next few years, I'm sure we're going to see a lot more exciting stuff and new developments on these different fronts. That's the end of this segment.